The Firelance, Chapter 1, The Return. Norm stood behind the fence outside his forge, looking towards the horizon between the long houses with red roofs and curved walls, where against the sun a small group of riders closed in on their village of Akronod. The villagers had gathered. It seemed that finally the lords of the village were returning. And sure enough, first in the column, the elder and the youngest could be seen. Behind them, the Almagiri, the apprentices and warriors of the lord pair of young and old, deed and wisdom, rising and setting sun. As they entered the hamlet, the 6 horses came to stop before the village temple around the well. When they sat down from their horses, everyone could see their exhaustion. Many villagers, including Norm therefore, made their way to the well and helped them take down what the Almagiri had brought with them. They had full saddlebags on the back of their horses, but something in their eyes, their faces, the way they sat down from their horses, was different. "What happened?" Ron called, the carpenter from the back of the crowd, as they helped the lords and the Almagiri carry luggage to the manor. The young lord by the name of Tren sat down in front of the temple, where now a small group of people had gathered, and began to report. "We went from the mountains back to Talinilad, carrying much loot from the Immortal King's campaign. And although we did not take the possessions of the living and stole ancient artifacts which did not belong to the Murr in the first place, I wish I could have put it differently, but it was not pretty. It had the taste of the Great War against the Star Edenists. Tonga over there has not come away from it with his mind intact, too scared for his soul because of what he had to do, and too shocked that he was capable of doing it. All, including Norm, looked over where the mother of the Almagiri Tonga tried to talk to him with silent tears, whilst the boy just kept staring into the nothingness. Those who did not keep staring directed their attention back to Tren in order not to have to feel empathy for the mother just yet. Only Elana, Norm's wife and the priest of the village, made her way over and started to talk to them, with Tariana, their 7-year-old daughter, following close by. "Anyways," Tren continued with a sigh, not of indifference, but emotional exhaustion. "We went from the mountains back to Talinilad, but when we arrived there, the city had been burned down, almost to the last house." The crowd gasped. "It turns out," Tren continued, "there were many campaigns the Murr committed in our lands when we deemed it wise to make war in theirs, so we did not manage to sell any of that which we had gathered. So in a bit, we will leave again, maybe in a day or more, to Duraan." The people in the crowd started asking questions, but Norm did not listen. The village had run low on grain, having underestimated the amount they might give to the crown for their war. The additional silver could have come in very handy, but at least there was loot, and the lords had returned. As he was thinking these thoughts, the crowd started talking amongst itself, and Tren walked over to him. He had his saddlebag hanging over his shoulder. "Still crying goodbye?" Tren asked with a smirk. Norm started to smile with a wide grin and gave his friend a hug. "I see you came back in one piece, with no notable increase to your mental deficiency." Tren laughed. He then looked over his shoulder, and his face got a bit more serious. "I found something you might be interested in." His hand slid into the saddlebag as he pulled out a small wooden and iron box with nature rune engravings along the top. Norm took it and with arched eyebrow looked at Tren. "A box? A powder? See the runes? It is an old ancient alchemist box." Norm nodded and carefully opened it and closed it immediately. "The box alone is worth a couple of gold letters," Norm remarked. "You are going to sell it in Duraan?" "Yes," Tren admitted, "but I want you to have what's in it. But make sure to keep it away from fire. There is a flame symbol here." He pointed at the little symbol carved into the wood. "Good that you're giving it to a smith then," Norm chuckled. Tren stepped forward so only Norm could hear him. "This is exactly why I want you to have it." Tren turned away with a smile, carrying his saddlebags to the manor. Norm looked down to the box in his hands. Chapter 2, The Forge. The Iron Heart Forge was Norm's true home. On the walls there hang his flatters, tongs, sledges, his punches, chisels, fullers, and rivets. Next to the furnace, the fire lit the anvil of his forefathers. Here they had stood for more than 300 years, generation over generation, forging the weapons of heroes. But none of them were around anymore. The war had claimed them, some lost, some still in service, both the weapons and the heroes. And now they were needed more than ever. The immortal kingdom, as anyone knew, had been attacked by the Murr, who went about burning towns and villages. Good steel could protect the country. It could save lives and spread confidence amongst the warriors in the field protecting the people, such people as those in Norm's village. His father, blessed be his soul, was by now resting in the Soul Tree Grove. He had taught Norm everything he knew. Every one of his ancestors had made contributions during their times, and every time they did, earlier or later, that invention could be found somewhere else in the fight against the beasts, or on the walls of a castle defending it against the barbarians. He went about starting a fire, throwing together some charcoal, smaller wood, and lighting it. And then he took the box that Tren had given him and sat down next to the anvil. Slowly, he filled its contents into 6 smaller tin cups. He put the box aside to return it to Tren, and then sat down next to the anvil with one of the cups. He carefully angled the cup so the sunlight coming through the open fourth wall of the forge could illuminate its contents. He could see a dark brown powder. The sizes of each speck was unlike the other, giving it an appearance of impurity. "Keep it away from the fire," Tren had said. He looked around and found a tong to hold a small, flat bronze plate on which he added a bit of the powder. But before he could go through with his experiment, he noticed behind him someone entering. He looked around, suspecting one of his apprentices, but saw his wife, Ilana, instead. He put the tong away and looked up. She sat down without saying a word. In her brown eyes, he saw exhaustion, and something more that he had not seen before. "Tonga?" he asked. She nodded. Eventually she took a deep breath and forced herself to speak. "The others say Talinilad was burnt down." Norm nodded slowly. "Yeah, I believe that Tren talked to the rest, and while you were tending to Tonga. How is he, by the way?" "Not good. Talinilad is very close." She switched the topic. Norm had tried to avoid that. "I'm sure the Murr will have no interest in a little village on the Hulaikris plain." She looked at him with a mix of concern and exhaustion. "I hope you're right. But what if you're not?" He said nothing, looking further into the flame. He knew what she was asking, and she knew it too. "I know you've never been much concerned about your own safety, but I am, and so is your daughter," she said. Another silence. "I know what the forge means to you. For 300 years my fathers have been here." She nodded. "I know. And I have not yet made my own invention." She inched closer and leaned against him. "Let us go to Alira. You can do it there." "I would not have my tools. We wouldn't have the means to buy them. Most of it I could not transport." She said nothing. What was the risk of staying? Was it worth the cost of leaving? How could he tell? Lost to avoid risk, everything in him revolted against it. The danger of sacrificing what must not be sacrificed. That evening no decision was made, and so it remained between them. Even after she had left the forge, he sat there alone and thought deeper into their conversation. It felt like his stomach had tightened. For a while he could do nothing but stare at the fire. Eventually, though, he decided to forget about it for the night and picked up the tong with the brown powder on it. He went over to the forge fire, braced himself, and as he was holding it into the heat, it immediately burned violently. For a moment he stood there in awe. He had noticed the violence with which the flame had burned. It had almost exploded. He could see it. The might, the potential, and it took his mind off the conversation he previously had. And if it was only for that short rest of the night in the forge, as he started to experiment. Chapter 3. Paralysis. The Hulaikris was a flat plain. Somewhere a few hundred meters away from the village center, there was a small hill on which some bushes grew. This little place had an old windmill in need of repair, and nobody had been there in the recent moons. Exactly at this spot, a man with a monocular and green clothing was laying on his belly, hidden in the bushes that day, watching the village. Nobody knew that he was there, and what he wanted. But if they would have known, they might have considered leaving. Ilana was again at the house of the two lords attending to Tonga, but most of the village had already given up hope. Nonetheless, it was her duty as the village's priest and mental healer not to give up hope. She had to prepare for the ritual that was held monthly in the temple. Norm had been similarly busy, spending most evenings and nights in the forge. He was obsessed with the brown powder. It had not taken him long to figure that a barrel might be the best object to force the energy contained in the powder on one point. In addition, the lead he had lying around made for good bolts. But his invention was less powerful than a bow and hard to aim. He had to tug it under his shoulder as it was too heavy. In short, it was a work in progress. As they were both busy with their own tasks, they managed well to get out of each other's way. Nobody had yet touched the topic again, but it had by now been almost a full moon, so he felt like meeting her somewhat halfway. And so he had started taking care of their daughter Tariana, who now sat outside in the evening sun with a couple of her friends watching him. He could see the community house at the other side of the road, where a couple of kids looked over, then nervously away. They got ready to run down to the small creek, but did not ask Tariana and the two friends with her to join. He was loosely aware that it was not always easy for her to make friends with the rest of the village kids, partially because they knew she was the daughter of a priest, and everyone respected the priest, even more than the lord sometimes, and that made the children afraid to ask her to join. He had asked her today to go play in front of the forge, but she and her friends just sat there. "So what's this?" he inquired, as he was putting a tongue of hot metal into cooling water. Through the vapor, he watched their reactions. "We want to go to the river," Tariana complained. He groaned. The thing with the working and watching kids at the same time was not really coming along too well. "Where do you want to go?" "To the river." He nodded. He remembered the river, as it was 30 years ago, and it had not changed a bit. The great falcon tree that stood at the other side of its shore was factually the best climbing tree in the whole world. At least he remembered his 10-year-old self being certain of that. It was there that he had conceived of becoming a great warrior with a legacy to remember into the ages. He did not say anything. Searching for a reason to abdicate his responsibility, he thought of how the other grown-ups let their children play there, with only the supervision of the old Clover. It was another discussion postponed indefinitely. The fact that the priests were only allowed to have one child meant that he and Ilana were more protective than almost any other parent of her one daughter. Could he just forego the discussion and let her go? Surely nothing would happen, and as long as they were back early enough, Clover was there to watch them after all. "You don't like the forge?" he asked whilst fishing for new tools to get to work on another piece. "No, it's loud and full of things that kill people." It stung a bit. He wondered who had put that thought in her head. Maybe a war-weary Almajiri? He did not reply, but instead sighed, shook his head, and then smiled at her. "Okay, you can go to the river, but stay where Clover can see you. That is the condition." Tariana smiled widely. She left the forge and ran back into the evening sun with her friends after her. As he was standing there, leaning on the hammer, resting on the anvil, Ron and his son Khaled came walking around the forge and closed in on him. The 14-year-old Khaled did his best to help his dad carry wood supplies and tools. Norm waved them over, and they dropped the supplies on the workbench in the center of the forge. For a week now, Ron had started working together with Norm, and he had been making himself useful. Now a couple of handles, wooden plates, and a shoulder pad form lay on the table. Khaled watched the two men discuss and try to fit things together. They nodded, rearranged parts, and eventually they seemed to agree that Ron should add a new block to it, but he left the parts he had made with Norm for further testing. After all was said and done, Norm watched Khaled and Ron leave. For a moment he sat down and felt into himself. What Tariana had said her disinterest, seeing Khaled learn from Ron, the decision he was bound to make. It all mixed up in his head and filled him with a sense of dread. The kind you feel when you know you should be doing something, but you don't have any intention to find out what, because the result of your consideration would likely cause you discomfort if you would have to act on it. He honestly tried, but eventually he stood up, looked down on the parts on the table, and decided to start assembling them. For what it was worth, his project was coming together, and would soon be ready for the first test. Chapter 4. Death of the Elder. The invention lay before him on the table. The polished metal glistened as the fire of the forge reflected on it. He had sat there for a while, just looking at it. With a little luck, after some extensive tests, it would work. He looked outside. The sun had just set, and Ron was supposed to have been there by now, but Norm was still alone. He stood up and started walking up and down. He left the forge, went around to check that the metal plate nailed to the stick in the ground was still stuck there, as intended, leaned his weight against it, and took a step back. It had not moved, as was intended. He walked back to the forge, looking over the horizon where the last red of the sun was fading into the light of the 2 moons. Something wasn't right. He decided to go looking for Ron and started making his way towards the carpenter workshop on the other side of the village. As he went there, he came by the house of the lords and spotted a closed door. This was unusual. He looked around, then walked towards it and knocked. What was going on? In the hall he entered stood Tren, Ilana, and a couple of others, including the Almagiris with drawn swords. They surrounded a bed that had been moved into the middle of the room. He moved closer, and there the old lord lay, dead. The faces were illuminated by the soul's coalescence above the dying. Tren didn't say a word. Everyone was silent. Then the shadow subsided, and the soul ascended, shining in a bluish light. People made haste, and Ron came in with a wooden stretcher on which the old man was placed with care. The Almagiris stood to each side whilst Ilana took the beginning of the procession, beginning to sing the rhyme of the Silent Valley. The people on both sides walked humming the melody. Only Tren remained left sitting on the table. Norm walked over to him and sat down. From there they watched the doors open and the silhouette of the old man being carried away. The doors closed and there was nothing but silence for a moment. Norm put a hand on Tren's shoulder. They sat there like this for a bit. Then Tren stood up and started pacing. Clearly something was on his mind. Unsurprisingly, he tried clumsily to get at the core of the matter. Isn't it weird that we go about our day and we think of the most important matters for the next days, and then all of a sudden we are reminded that nothing of the little things really matters? But they do, don't they? You know, they matter in the big picture, but only if the last page is written. He sat down, but couldn't sit still, so he stood back up and kept pacing. It's not even that. It's just legacy, you know, Norm? I know, Tren. Tell me, how was it when your old man died? Norm thought about it for a while and then said, I have always looked up to my father. He taught me everything I knew, and I was eager to test myself. And I did. He had taught me well. I think it was because I got bogged down in making little things. Some swords there, arrow tips here, and then there was the union with Ilana, our child, the immortal king's decrees. I never really made, I guess, what could have been done. I think in a way it was not my father's legacy to invent the ribbon bolt loader for the heavy crossbows. His legacy was me. And when he died, I wasn't worth it yet, I think. Tren looked down at his hands with a letter in it. I'm not sure if I'm ready. Norm stood up from the bench. You will be in time. I could have been ready earlier. In any possible scenario, this is true. I appreciate that you're trying to comfort me, but I was lazy. I could have studied more. I could have tested more. I could have consulted more mentors, and I didn't. Norm frowned. Tren, is there something I should know? He pointed at the letter. Tren looked at him with a glassy gaze and handed over the letter. The door of the hall swung open and Ron entered. He had returned to pick up a few things he had left after bringing the stretcher in haste. Behind him followed Ilana, and she stopped near Tren. "He is now laid to rest in his spot," she told Tren. He nodded. "I will go over to see after him when we have taken the necessary precautions." "Precautions?" Ilana asked. Tren nodded towards Norm, who was now reading the letter. It was written from one of the Almajiris who had left weeks earlier with the objects they were planning to sell in Duraan. The letter was a dark omen. The riders had been engaged by a skirmishing Murr war party. Most of them had died, only a few had survived, and now they were reluctant to make their journey back through to the village, leaving the walls of Duraan. The letter had reached them by pigeon. It was a couple of days old. Norm put down the paper. A shudder ran down his spine. "Can we read?" Ilana stepped closer, and Ron also made his way over. Tren shrugged, and Norm handed over the letter. "It was my responsibility to see further, and I didn't." Tren had sunken into the bench. Ron, who had a small glimpse at the letter, nodded and started walking towards the door. "Where are you going?" Norm inquired. "To get my family out of here as long as we still can." Norm did not want to lift his gaze, afraid to have it cross with Ilana's. Eventually he decided to follow as well, trying to catch up with the carpenter. He saw him outside, walking down the street in a fast pace. "We are not yet done with the lance," Norm shouted. "So?" Ron replied without stopping. "If we leave now, we will not be able to finish it." Ron stopped and walked towards him, coming to stand a couple of meters in front of him. "I will take care of my family, and you should do the same." He turned away. Chapter 5. Silhouettes. "I'm taking care of my family," Norm shouted, but Ron wasn't listening and was now entering his community house. Something had built in him, an anger, a frustration. He wanted to kick or hit something, but instead gritted his teeth together and ran to the forge. It had to work. Once arrived, he saw the Firelance, still laying on the table as he had left it. He picked it up together with a coal bucket full of ember, a small cup with the dark powder, and one with a few lead balls. Thus armed, he hastily ran around and behind his workshop to where the wooden plank with the metal on it sat. He put the lance on the ground, added the powder, the ball in a separate chamber, and then finished with a tongue for a small piece of ember which he carefully set in an opened hatch near the hole in which he had filled the powder. With all the patience he could muster given his state, he picked up the weapon, laid it, how it was meant to be, on his shoulders, and aimed. Thoughts ran through his head, such as how he should be more afraid, and somewhere in the back of his mind a voice reminded him he was being reckless to experiment in his current condition. But there was no time, no patience, no need for these concerns. He aimed, and then he moved the right handle forward. The hatch at the back of the weapon shut. The embers drove into the powder. There was a bang, smoke everywhere. It was like someone had hit with a sledgehammer against the front of the barrel. He almost lost control over it. His arms hurt. Slowly, the smoke cleared. Norm squinted. The metal plate and wood were gone. They laid a bit further on the ground. He carefully but hastily dropped the lance and ran over. A lead bullet had made its way through the metal and bulged the wood at the backside. A smouldering hole remained where the lead ball had entered. The man with the monocular and green clothing lay on his belly hidden in the bushes on the hill behind the mill, watching a small crowd of people gather around the forge where a loud noise had captured his attention. Something strange had been happening there. As he wandered with his gaze over the crowd, he looked down the street and then a little bit further up and down. And there, at the horizon against the setting sun, he saw shadows, many shadows. The man set down his monocular, smiled, and crawled, retreating into the bushes. A group of people had gathered around Norm, who had made his way back to inspect the lance. "What was that?" inquired one of the farmer boys, Gallic. Norm smiled. For a moment he let himself be distracted. For a moment he allowed himself to feel the weight that had just been removed from his shoulders by such a fortunate turn of events. How was it possible that the weapon had worked on its first test, and with such success? What more was possible? He picked it back up, looked through its barrel, inspecting the residue of powder on the chamber. "This, dear Gallic, is a Firelance," he proclaimed without hiding his smile, "and it will come in very handy when we have to leave and get some gold wherever we might arrive." He shouldered his creation. Then he noticed disturbed faces. "We are leaving?" Gallic asked. A general unease spread through the crowd. "Yes, maybe, I think. It's being considered." More unease, but now Norm felt the back of the crowd had spotted something. Many began to intersperse. Everyone started to turn and look down the road towards the place where the sun was setting. He too followed them, and indeed, there were riders. Many riders, and men marching in columns on foot. Some of the villagers who had just stood in a circle started turning towards the community houses, but most stood and watched as slowly the shadows drew closer on the village community, opposite the temple. As they drew closer, Norm became more and more certain. They were soldiers. Chapter 6. Soldiers. The soldiers drew nearer. Now most of the village had left their houses and slowly came together to form a crowd around the well in front of the temple. Some Almajiri had joined the crowd and nervously held their hands over their swords and spears. Nobody talked. Nobody walked away as the caravan drew nearer. Then, somewhere amongst the rank, a few soldiers slowly lifted two banners. One of their unit and one of their king. Whispers went through the crowd, as those with sharp eyes spotted them. Slowly the villagers started to talk, and then move forwards. Some started cheering. Norm squinted to see the labels on the flags, but wasn't sure of the meaning. He leaned the invention against the wall of the forge, then walked through the crowd looking for Tren, who had taken up position not too far from the house of the lords. "What do the symbols mean?" Norm inquired, slightly out of breath. "Safety," Tren smiled. "For all my flaws, it appears the human community has sent deliverance. You see, Tren, the 5th Zandorian Regiment of King Orvin. They must have come from Jarrow or Alera, and they were on their way to the front. I am sure they will deal with any warbands. We might travel with them. We will see. This is a good sign. Yes. Yes." Norm looked at Tren, who smiled across his whole face. It reminded Norm of how he felt when the Firelance had turned out to be an instant success. Now the first line of horses entered. The whole track started to make a circle around the well and stop before the temple. Tren sprang into action and ran to the steps where Ilana was already greeting the first members of the vanguard. Norm stayed, watching Ilana interact with the strangers. Something in his stomach immediately cramped together, the kind that reminds you of your previous blissful unawareness of a persisting issue you had chosen to ignore. But this time he knew what to do. He of course had failed to leave the village, but not only were they safe now, he also had a further idea which could make everything much, much better. And then he would talk to her, and he would say, sorry, and it would all be back to normal. But first he needed to see what was going on, and if his plan would come together. So he went over to where he could hear Tren talk to the vanguard. The vanguard soldiers were wearing heavy armor, whilst the rest of the caravan wearing light metal or standard issue textile. The convoy was huge. It must have been 250 combatants easily, and even more logistic vehicles, oxens with carts, and there was even a dragon rider somewhere in the sky circling their position. Norm could see her every now and again in the sky, behind the roofs of the courtyard, making her scouting flights. Tren and Ilana had clearly asked the soldiers to stay, which seemed to have been their intention. Soon a man with an artfully designed armor stepped through the ranks, escorted by 6 swordsmen with huge 1.5-meter shields. He stepped up to Tren, and Tren saluted. Then they started talking silently with each other. Both nodded after the one had spoken, and eventually they exchanged salutes, and the commander told something to a man to the right, then stepped onto a pillbox and shouted, "Notice to the village of Akronod. Please do not leave your houses by nightfall. 5th Regiment. We will stay for 7 hours with 2 hours construction and 2 hours deconstruction. 1st Century is on guard duty. 2nd and 3rd Century on fortification duty. All Genron coordinates, march reports to headquarters once everything is set up. Wagon fort around the city center. Command tent close to the temple." The man kept shouting commands, whilst Norm used the moment to sneak up to Tren. "They are staying? The fella you talked to was their commander?" Tren nodded. "The man I just talked to is the Zandorian coordinate Waymond, who commands this little army here, which is referred to as the 5th Regiment of King Orvin. They were stationed in Larau at the beginning of the war, from where they are now being repositioned. They have not told me where they will be moving next. Possibly Katera, or Talinilad, or Duraan, who knows? But they will be here for the night, and I will ask them if we can accompany them as soon as we are set up." Norm frowned. "This way we would need to pack everything tonight and leave. I will first talk with him. For tonight we are safe. It's a good omen. The community is strong." Tren marched off, clearly in good spirits. Only Norm was left. He made his way through the mass of villagers that now chatted lively with a few of the soldiers of the 4th Century who were not assigned to build duty. Around the village, carts of supplies were drawn into place, and smaller tent-like structures started springing up everywhere within the time he had talked to Tren. Eventually he stood in front of the forge. For a moment he stared at the lance leaning against the wall. Then he picked it up and sat down on the anvil that stood outside under a small roof. From where he saw how guards were assigned and the command tent was built around the Zandorian and Genron coordinates, who were standing around a small table-like wagon with a few maps and papers. The dragon now drew in closer, and some men and women in official uniforms shooed away some of the villagers to make space for the landing. The beast sat down right aside the temple and shrieked, shaking its neck and looking at the frightened crowd, like it was aware of the impact it had on everyone around. The 2 riders sat down and came walking over to the now almost completed command tent, where the command staff convened. Norm decided to stay a little longer, and then he would try it. He would talk to the Zandorian about his invention. Surely there was gold in it, enough for the whole village. Nervously he looked down the long neck of the lance and thought a moment. Then an idea came to his mind and he smiled. He started walking up and down in the forge. A plan of how he would sell his invention started to form in his mind. Chapter 7. The Pitch. "Shouldn't we first ask if we can join them on their way to wherever?" Tren suggested. "No, I think it's best if we show him the weapon first. Maybe we can use it as a pretext to escort us out." "Unlikely," Tren remarked. "Wouldn't they be interested in just giving you an escort? I could demand for the whole village to follow." Tren thought about it for a moment and shrugged his shoulders. "Let's just not waste his time." The tent entrance was opened and the Genrons walked out, lively chatting with each other. Then it closed again. It stayed closed for a few moments until finally a guardswoman opened it from the inside and signaled them to come inside. The darkness had now fallen all across the village, and among the houses fires were lit. Tren had seen Ilana and Tariana move to the community house a little while ago. He hoped to return soon with good news, and now was the time to make that happen. He and Tren looked at each other, nervously. Then they stepped in. The interior of the tent was very sparsely decorated, with just a small wagon as a rudimentary table, a bigger chest as a box bed. Norm had imagined it to be more luxurious. At the end of the table stood the Zandorian Waymond, and quietly whispered something in conversation with his guards. Norm and Tren stood and waited for him to finish for a while. Then he was finally done and moved his attention to his visitors. His age was hard to guess. He looked a 40-year-old, but his mannerisms seemed to suggest he had seen more than most. His uniform was of the dark red-orange and black that characterized the Northern Immortal Kingdom legions. "Good evening, gentlemen," he began. "I heard you needed to talk to me. I'm sure we can discuss village logistics. The expenditure of edibles I thought we might regulate from here, for example, before it's all traded away." Tren nodded. "Certainly, but actually we are here because of two other matters." He pointed towards the firelance that Norm held in a tight embrace. "I have seen it when we entered the village, and admit I am intrigued," the Zandorian smiled. "Is it a weapon? It looks a bit heavy, doesn't it?" "Yes, the design is very much a work in progress. One is actually not supposed to use it as a lance." "You show me this because?" "I thought you might know where I could sell it, or if it would be possible to sell it at all." The Zandorian nodded. "I will have a look, but I cannot take it off of you. You will have to go to the headquarters in one of the cities, in which there is an army command." It wasn't clear to Norm why he thought the Zandorian would have just bought it off of him, like one might buy fruit at a marketplace. But he buried his frustration. Telling Ilana the Zandorian approved of the invention and deemed it worth something wherever they might go after this was better than nothing. Maybe it was enough. "That would be a good thing," Norm nodded. "The lance is simple. It is a long-ranged weapon. The exact range still needs to be tested. This is also a very early model. The later ones will be simpler and probably lighter as we optimize the materials. I also intend to find a better reload mechanism. It can punch through iron armor using a powder I acquired which possesses special incendiary qualities. I have called it brown powder, for the lack of a better name. We should possibly test it outside in the field, away from most people." The Zandorian looked at them, the lance, and then back at them. "I cannot really leave the camp, you see," he explained. Norm nodded. "Then you will have to see the demonstration tomorrow by good light." "I will. Ranged weapons that punch through iron armor might be of great use to Orvan's armed forces. Of course, if it would show promise, it might be at least in the interest of the army to acquire the invention. If it is not developed, it at least does not fall into the hands of the enemy. As we cannot test it now, we will discuss the matter in detail tomorrow." Unsure of how to feel, Norm nodded, picked up the lance, and took a step backwards. At least he would have a look at it tomorrow, and the Zandorian had said that there was a promise in it, if it did what he already had seen it could. But he had hoped for more. In his mind, the Zandorian would have been impressed by the imagination and craftsmanship that had gone into the design, demanded it be tested immediately, and rich reward paid out after a successful demonstration. This had been naive. He now understood. "One more concern," Tren stepped forward. The Zandorian nodded in approval. "We were very relieved to see the Legion reach us. We had feared that a war party that earlier had slain one of our armed scout units, one of two, would find the village and do as they pleased. We wanted to ask if it is possible to stay with the caravan until the next town or castle." Wayman's face darkened. He sighed and slowly shook his head. "I really only can commit to an answer tomorrow morning," he said, as if he wanted to end the conversation immediately. Norm and Tren exchanged glances. "Is there anything we might be able to do until tomorrow to help the decision?" Tren asked carefully. But the Zandorian seemed absent. He pressed his finger against his lips as if to signal for silence. Norm and Tren stood silently, unsure of what was happening. Then they heard it. Somewhere outside, a crossbow bolt hit wood. Through the thin wall of the tent they could hear running, now commands, then a volley of arrows hitting and sticking in the ground. The Zandorian lifted his head, then he nodded. He took his saber, which had previously lain on the table, and ran past the two villagers. Tren and Norm looked at each other. Then they unfroze, and Tren drew his sword and followed the commander. Chapter 8. The Choice. Norm followed Tren over the flat grassy plain that led over from behind the temple to the market plaza. His senses were heightened. Over the village flew something small that burned and emitted smoke and vast amounts of red light. Surely a magical excavation from one of the Murr caves. The ground over which he ran threw shadows on every small bump, and he could see every single grass straw in his attempt to make sure not to stumble as he ran. In one hand, the ember bucket, and over the shoulder, the heavy fire lance. He knew where he needed to go, and so he did not look much left nor right, although it did not escape him that all the soldiers from their regiment were up in arms and fighting. A few inside the village itself, but most on the wagon barricades that had been put in place. In the center, a small wagon circle had been established, and a few soldiers who stood around it with heavy shields, swords and crossbows were urging the villagers to gather there. He spotted some of the generons shouting orders, and a bit further away he could see the dragon riders drop iron darts into the shadows. Somehow, royal soldiers had made it up onto the roofs of the temple and the house of the lords from where they fired their crossbows. To his left, a group of peculiar figures had made it through the ring. They were hooded in black cloaks, and he would not have seen them if it were not for the torches they carried. As he was running towards the crossing, he saw them on his right, running up to the forge. He stopped, almost tripped over. Tren noticed him. "Norm, come with, now!" An eternal moment it seemed. He looked at the forge down the small road to his right, and the men with the torches running towards it. The left way went down to the community house, the right to the forge. He made a decision. "I'm here," he shouted to Tren, picking up speed. Tren turned and ran left, and Norm followed. Through the gate they could see into the courtyard. There he saw them, a few villagers, Ilana and Tariana. They had come together in a small huddle around the center tree. A surge of relief. They were here, both of them. "Everyone, there is a protection zone in the middle of the village. Follow me, we're going," shouted Tren. Everyone stood up. Ilana took Tariana by the hand. Norm's and Ilana's gaze met. He nodded. Ilana closed up to him as he turned, and they began to run. They came around the corner of the community house. There he could see the forge in flames. There was no feeling in him. It was unreal. He focused on his breath, then reminded himself to look behind him and wait up for his daughter and the elders from the village. When he turned back around, he saw that Tren had stopped. In front of them, between the protection parameter, they saw 3 heavily armored swordsmen fighting and stabbed 2 royal crossbowmen. Their blood splashes were visible against the fire as they fell to the ground with terrible screams. Whilst 2 of the armored soldiers finished the job properly, the third looked towards them, then closed his armor sight. Without spending a second to think deeper into it, Norm fell to his knees, rolling the lance from his shoulder, controlling it with his hands. It was not a soft landing, but there was no time. The tongue had gone missing, but he didn't care. He grabbed some ember with his bare hands. Ignoring the pain, he put it into the small slot at the weapon's side. Without having looked, he stood up, shouldered the lance, and aimed. At the soldier right in front of him. Tren lay on the ground, with the sword protectively stretched out over his head. The man in front of him raised his weapon. Norm pushed the slider. Smoke, a powerful blow. He almost lost balance. Through the smoke he could see the other 2 enemy soldiers looking at their fallen comrade. Norm looked down at the body with a huge smoking gap in his chest. He looked up and took aim. There was no further bullet or powder in the chamber, but they didn't know. For a moment the 2 armored soldiers stood there, frozen. But when Norm pulled back the slider, they turned and started to run in the opposite direction and disappeared behind some of the carriages. Tren made it back to his feet. He walked over to the man on the ground with a gap in his chest, and with ease of a veteran, slit the man's throat. Without a word, Tren turned and continued to run towards the protection zone. A few dead bodies had already accumulated around the protection zone, but the armored soldiers with the shields defending it were still around, and so, it seemed, was all of the village which had made its way into the small circle. They sat crouched on the ground between and under the wagons, wincing every time arrows hit nearby or one of the wagons. Norm kneeled down and put the Firelance aside. Next to him, Ilana and Tariana sat down. The little girl was shaking, so he put his arm around her as she crawled into his lap and shut her ears. Ilana leaned against him. His heart was pounding, but something in him had found a moment of clarity. As he was carefully holding his family, he had come to a final conclusion. Chapter 9. Legacy. His hands were still darkened from the earth he had moved. He had buried a part of him under the falcon tree, where his ambition to create a legacy had been conceived. As he walked over the plaza in the center of the village, he could see Tren argue with the Zandorian. "You knew all along. You were setting a trap and we were the bait." "You have to understand, I couldn't tell you because it would have given it away," Wyman protested. "This is why you created the wagon wall and slept in a simple tent?" Look, Wyman did his best to try and appease Tren, but so far he was not doing a good job. "We have taken out the vanguard of the 5th Murr Division. That is what we came for, and now I can promise you, we will escort you to the next city." Tren thought for a moment, but then eventually his facial expressions became a bit milder, just when Norm joined them. "I may accept that. Where are you headed?" "Back to Illyria, which is great. A good bit away from the front lines. Well protected because the immortal kingdoms needed for war shipments from Jarro, Kessador, and Larau." "Deal." Tren smiled and reached out for a handshake, but the Zandorian simply saluted and then turned. Before he left, though, he saw Norm. "I spotted this morning a dead Murr soldier with a gap in his chest plate. I think Army Headquarters would be interested in your invention." Norm smiled. "I'm grateful, but it seems like it has gotten lost in battle." "Lost?" the Zandorian inquired, surprised in disbelief. But Norm just pointed towards the still smouldering ashes of his forge. Tren and the Zandorian both looked at it for a moment. "Well," Wyman said eventually, "for what it's worth, it's here, in your head still, correct? So it is not entirely lost." Norm nodded, but said nothing. "I am sure," Wyman continued, "that such a bright mind will find a way out. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a tactical retreat to prepare." He saluted and marched off. Norm and Tren exchanged conspiratorial glances. "Is it lost for good?" Tren inquired. "As long as nobody decided to dig out the roots of the old falcon tree," Norm replied. Tren nodded. Then he patted Norm on the back and they walked towards the temple where a small field hospital had been set up. Before they reached it, Ron intercepted them. "Hey, you two. Norm, take care of your daughter. She's been asking for you all this time. Okay? And when you have a moment, I just wanted to say thanks for escorting Grandma to the protection zone." Norm shrugged. Tren smiled. "Oh, sure. I hope old Clover is doing all right." "She sure is, except for all the memories she now has to suffer. It's not well on her." Tren nodded. "She's not alone with that. Send her to Ilana when she has a spare moment." "Take care of her, yes?" "Of course," Ron replied. Then he quickly glanced over to Norm. "Have you—" Norm nodded. "Good." Ron smiled. Then he hurried off. Norm and Tren looked at each other again. Tren shook his head. "Man, good old Ron." They sat down on the stairs for a moment where they could see the field hospital. Norm began after a moment of blank stares into the void. "I don't know how to deal with it." Tren looked at him, then shook his head. "I don't think of it like that. I was the one who killed him. You just defended the people behind you." Norm looked to the ground. "You know, it's more that I think I will spend the rest of my life making nails, barrels, and decor." "Well?" Tren picked up a straw and balanced it in his mouth. "I don't blame you. All the better that you buried that weapon." And all this time I thought, but then, imagine the sheer potential of it. There was a moment of silence. "But now you buried it, and that was the right move. And everything ended up just fine." Mostly because of sheer stupid dumb luck. Tren giggled, then nodded. Norm shook his head and looked over. There was Ilana, tending to one of the dying, talking to her intimately. Yeah, that's about right, Tren continued. It was time we'd grow up. So now, duty calls. Off to see your daughter, who I heard has a new hero, you know. Tren sat up straight. In a way, your legacy was not what you did, but what you didn't do. Norm smiled. Already becoming the elder? Tren laughed and boxed his old friend, but Norm just looked over to Ilana. For the first time in weeks he searched for her eyes, but when they eventually met, she smiled.